Good afternoon. Welcome to today's panel on the Canada-US border in changing times, history, myths, and prospects. I'm Cheryl Camillo. I'm a professor here at the Johnson-Shoyama School of Public Policy in Saskatchewan, as well as an associate for the North American Observatory on Health Systems and Policies at the University of Toronto. I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's panel because it has this topic of the Canada-US border has special meaning for me. I grew up literally a few kilometers from the border and was raised there in Buffalo, New York, after my family migrated south from Hamilton, Ontario. And I am a comparative health systems researcher because of my experience with the Canadian and US healthcare systems. I understand that many of you are new to Johnson-Shoyama. This is the first JSGS event you're attending, so I'll introduce our school as well. The Johnson-Shoyama School, or JSGS as we know it, is the provincial center of advanced education and training in public policy, public administration, and health administration in Saskatchewan. We are a partnership of the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that reflects Saskatchewan's unique history of cooperation. We're located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And we're proud to say that since our inception in 2007, we've swiftly become one of Canada's leading schools at educating graduate students and public servants in advancing public values in the public sector. I believe we'll have close to 90 participants today. So in the interest of the event going smoothly, I'll ask that you keep your microphones on mute and your cameras off. And we'll engage in a discussion after the formal presentations via the chat box. Karen Jaster, who has coordinated this event, has sent a message about how to submit a question or comment. You do that by clicking chat, selecting my name, last name Camillo, from the drop-down menu, typing your message and hitting send. And I'll keep those in queue. The format of today is that each of our three presenters will give a presentation of about 15 to 20 minutes. And after the third presentation, I'll lead us in a Q&A session and discussion. If you have any logistical issues, please don't hesitate to contact Karen Jaster, Jaster, also through the chat box, and she'll be able to assist you. And lastly, before I do introductions, I'll let you know that we are going to, as we normally do for our public events, record this presentation and post it to our website later in the month. So now on to the introductions of our three panelists. First, joining us from Washington is Dr. Lori Troutman, who is the director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University. There she engages in a wide range of research activities related to the Washington State, British Columbia region of the Canada-US border. But in addition to working with students and faculty, she works closely with government agencies as well as private sector agencies to advance policy solutions as well as cross-border collaboration. She's on a number of working groups in doing that work. She's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the States, as well as a fellow with the Canadian Global Policy Institute. Welcome, Lori. Joining us from the other side of the continent is my friend and collaborator over the years, John Majori. He is currently senior advisor to the Governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo. That said, I have to be very clear today that he is here as himself. He's not representing the governor today, so the opinions he shares are his own. John has served Andrew Cuomo in a number of roles over the last few decades. Senior advisor since January of 2009. Prior to that, director of policy, previous regional director for the governor, and when the governor was Attorney General of New York State, from 2007 to 2010, John served as the Attorney General's appointee to the Peace Bridge Board, which is the major crossing between Buffalo, New York and Fort Erie, Ontario. You'll hear more about that shortly. John is a native of Buffalo, a graduate of Connecticut College, as well as the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, and has a Master of Public Administration degree from the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
And our third speaker will be my colleague, Professor Bruno de Peyron, who is our research chair, our graduate chair at the University of Regina campus of JSGS. His major research interests are border and immigration issues, specifically the transformation of cross-border governance in North America and Europe, as well as the regulation of security and mobility in North America. And he performs his research using political sociology and comparative perspectives. He is the principal investigator of a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada grant for international research. And he is a research chair in immigration, ethnicity, and citizenship at the University of Quebec at Montreal. Welcome, Bruno. So without further ado, I'll ask Lori to share her screen, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you again for joining.
Okay, hello everyone. Cheryl, are we good to go?
We sure are.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being on the line. And as Cheryl mentioned, I'm the director of the Border Policy Research Institute way out here in Washington State in the very northwest corner. We're about 30 kilometers south of the US-Canadian border, kind of sandwiched in between Vancouver and Seattle. And we were created almost exactly 15 years ago. And we were created largely out of a recognition that the events of 9/11, of the September 11th terrorist attacks, had a huge impact of the flow of goods and people between the state of Washington and the province of British Columbia. So our state actually created this dedicated research institute to conduct applied research on the border and inform different elements of policy. So it's quite interesting that now we're kind of moving into potentially a next phase of border management. So I have about 5 slides today and 2 main points to make. My first point is that the Canada-US border is comprised of regions that function very differently, yet we are governed by national policies. And my second point is that the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic will vary by region, and I think that has huge implications for our recovery. So this is a map that shows you basically the 3 different regions, main regions of the Canada-US border, and they connect in different ways. So these 3 regions, the Cascade Gateway, which is a collection of land border crossings between British Columbia and Washington, the Detroit-Windsor corridor, and then Buffalo-Niagara Falls comprise over 50% of all cross-border activity. So if you look at this bar graph, you can see Detroit is in light blue, Buffalo-Niagara is in red, and Cascade Gateway is in dark blue. And both truck volume and trade value is really dominated by Detroit-Windsor. And the volumes of trade and the value of trade and the volumes of trucks moving through the Cascade Gateway is relatively much smaller. And that's largely because we have different types of goods moving back and forth at those 2 regions. And then if you look at personal vehicle traffic, it's kind of the opposite. Cascade Gateway has the largest flows, although Buffalo-Niagara is pretty much the same number of people moving back and forth. And then Detroit-Windsor is quite small compared to those 2, or smaller. So even though these regions are comprised of different types of goods and different flows of people, the border policies that we have to govern them are really one size fits all, which means that each of these regions is going to react differently to those national policies and also to external events like the COVID-19 pandemic. So now I'm going to show you a graph that shows how passenger travel specifically through the land border into the US at each of these regions has changed over the last couple decades. So I'll just walk you through this quickly before I describe it. So again, this is people entering US land ports of entry by region and exchange rate. The Detroit-Windsor region is that same light blue color. Buffalo-Niagara is red, and then the Cascade Gateway out between BC and Washington is dark blue. And that green spotted line is the exchange rate, or the value of the Canadian dollar compared to the US dollar. So the higher that line is, the stronger the Canadian dollar is. So cross-border flows in each of these regions is obviously influenced by a number of factors, including population growth, economic growth or economic decline, but certainly also border policies as well as the exchange rate. Those are 2 really important things. So if you look around 2011, I've just sort of put some guides on here to help walk you through this graph. Volumes were on a downward trajectory overall in the late 90s prior to the September 11th terrorist attacks. However, it was really the policy responses around 9/11 that caused the volumes to drop and remain low. But even then, there was a different response in each region. And I won't get into Buffalo, Niagara too much because I think John will be speaking about that. But if you look at Detroit, you can see that really the events of 9/11 fed into some broader structural issues and caused a continual decline in the number of people entering the border there. And if you look at the Cascade Gateway, which is again that dark blue line, you can see we experienced a dip initially, but then we kind of rose out of it pretty quickly. And something else that had a major impact on the flows in these regions is, of course, the relationship between the exchange rate and cross-border flows, which is different in each region. So I've highlighted this little window between 2010 and 2013 when there was a really, really strong Canadian dollar. And if you look within those two yellow lines between those dates, you can see how differently the Cascade Gateway, that dark blue line, reacted to the strength of the Canadian dollar versus the Detroit-Windsor corridor, that light blue line, which remained completely unaffected and completely flat by that growth in the Canadian dollar. Something else that also happened in our region in 2010, we had the Vancouver Olympics. And this was a really big deal for our region because there was a lot of investment in the border, in the infrastructure connecting both the province and the state to the border, and also some major policy advancements like the enhanced driver's license. So it was the state of Washington and the province of British Columbia that developed the enhanced driver's license leading up to the 2010 Vancouver Olympics, really as a way to ensure that people would be able to get back and forth if they didn't have passports. So, you know, these differences is in terms of different regions that react differently to the value of the Canadian dollar really comes down to who's crossing the border and why they're crossing. So in my region, about 75% of border crossings are Canadian people coming back and forth. And they're crossing primarily for discretionary purposes. So shopping, tourism, recreation, that accounts for about 3/4% of all trips, so completely discretionary. Only about 1% of the Canadians who are entering the US here are crossing for work, and that's a very different situation in Detroit, Windsor. So these regional different characteristics of each region are really going to shape how these cross-border volumes resume as we recover from COVID-19. If you think about a region where employment is driving people moving back and forth versus a region like ours where people literally will drive down to the county where I live just to go to Costco and buy milk and fill up on gas, you know, coming out of this situation, those regions are going to react very differently. So I want to just give you a little bit of a portrait of the Cascadia region because I think most of you are quite far away from here. So we have a really unique border region, and I say that because we have this real common identity. And our former governor of Washington State here, Christine Gregoire, she used to say that Washingtonians have more in common with their neighbors in British Columbia than any other state in the US. And I really think that's true. We have very common environmental values, political values, and quality of life values. We both feel like we're very far from Ottawa and DC, and that has a lot to do with how we sort of relate to each other. So there's this common sort of regional concept of Cascadia that extends along that west coast of British Columbia and Washington State, and some would argue down into Portland as well. And we have a very, very connected economy. I haven't spoken about trade necessarily, but we do a lot of trade back and forth. One brief example is in Washington State. We import a lot of unrefined oil and natural gas from British Columbia. We refine it here in refineries in the county that are, again, just about 30 kilometers south of the border. And a lot of that goes straight back up to BC and is actually used as jet fuel at Vancouver International Airport, which, of course, right now there's not a lot of demand for. But we also have a lot of Canadians shopping in the border counties as well. And we have a really strong cross-border institutional fabric. So by that, I mean we have these initiatives and these organizations whose day job or whose primary mission is to focus on that BC relationship. My institute is a great example of that, but there's a number of other initiatives that span environmental management and other cross-border collaborative mechanisms as well. And we have really good governance and collaboration. This photo down here is Premier Horgan and Governor Inslee signing a memorandum of understanding on an initiative to to kind of integrate our economies even more. And we have good government-to-government relations at different scales. So it's not just at that leadership scale, the premier and the governor, it's also the Departments of Transportation and the Coast Guard and a lot of other different agencies. And we have some really good border policy innovations that I think come out of the fact that we do have this really close working relationship that's somewhat institutionalized and really part of our ethos out here. I mentioned the enhanced driver's license, which was created out of collaboration between British Columbia and Washington State. We also had the precursor to the Nexus program here. Some of you may be aware of the Nexus program. It's a trusted traveler program that expedites people who are going back and forth across the border. And we have the highest number of Nexus enrollees anywhere in the two countries out here in this region. So people in this region are very connected, and how the border is managed moving forward will play a critical role in our economic recovery and the degree to which we're able to maintain that sense of connection and that integrated economy and also that collaborative infrastructure that's really been built up after 9/11 happened. And we really recognize that maintaining that cross-border integration requires a lot of work and a lot of engagement. So I had just two more slides that are really pivoting now to look more at the COVID-19 crisis. So this slide shows the southbound vehicle volume in the Cascade Gateway. So how many cars are entering the US essentially, which is more or less the same number going into Canada. It's a revolving door system. And so the gray bar chart is the number of cars entering, and the blue dotted line is the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Washington State. And the red dotted line is the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in British Columbia. So there's a couple things that stand out here. Obviously, there's a very large discrepancy between the number of cases in Washington and the number of cases in BC, which I think mirrors the overall situation between the United States and Canada. But what's interesting here, and that what I want to point out, is that the cross-border volumes aligned pretty closely between 2020 and 2019 up until about the end of February and the first week in March. So if you look on this graph, you can see February 29th was the first death from COVID-19 in Washington State. And I believe at that time, it might have been the first death in the United States that was known to be associated with COVID-19. And you can see the volumes start to drop right after that happened. On March 11th, the WHO declared a global pandemic and the volumes dropped further. And then on March 14th, British Columbia announced a number of closures and restrictions, including a voluntary 2-week quarantine for any Canadians returning from the US. So the federal restrictions on the border, which are in place now, which are restricted all non-essential travel and cargo is exempt from that restriction, those weren't put in place until March 21st. But you can see that the volumes had declined well before that. So the 2 points I want to highlight with this slide and this data is to say that provincial and state efforts combined with overall public health concerns by travelers had impacted these cross-border flows well before the border restrictions were put in place by the US and Canada. And the role of subnational governments in this pandemic, both looking back in terms of restrictions that were put in place by British Columbia as well as Washington State, and going forward and recovering from the crisis, are pretty significant. And this is probably more the case in the United States than Canada because our federal government has given us such little guidance, really, and the governors of the states have had to take on so much of this governance role, even though it's an international context when we talk about the border. And my third point is that I think the influence of public health concerns have a major impact on cross-border travel, as we can see from this graph, and I think they're going to continue to have a major impact on cross-border travel, regardless of what happens with the border restrictions. So my final slide is looking at COVID-19 and the cross-border economy. So the current border restrictions that are in place on all non-essential travel between the US and Canada at our land borders are due to expire June 21st. They were just extended another month earlier this week. And what we see pretty much across the board, these numbers are specific to the Cascade Gateway, but I think they hold true more or less across the border, is passenger flows are down about 98%. And this is completely unprecedented. Even after 9/11, we did not see drops like this. They were closer to about 50% on a month-to-month basis. Cargo, even though it's unrestricted between the two countries, is also down around 20%, although it's starting to increase a little. This is primarily due to supply chain disruptions, which you've probably all heard about in the news, and also problems with truckers having access to services. And in our region, we also have, I'm not sure what the case is in Saskatchewan, but in our region, we also have a provincial checkpoint. After you cross the border into Canada, there's a provincial checkpoint that ensures that you have a quarantine plan in place, and if you don't have a quarantine plan in place when you enter Canada, that they will help you develop one. So there's kind of two remaining questions that I'm really grappling with out here, working at an institute that studies border policy. I would guess that anyone else engaged in these issues are grappling with the same questions, which is how do we reconnect our cross-border economy? And out here, I know it's the case in Buffalo Niagara as well, tourism is a very huge part of our economy. And in the Pacific Northwest or the Cascadia region, we have this huge maritime connection, whether it's the Alaska ferries, it's the ferries connecting Vancouver Island and Washington State, or the cruise ship industry, which, you know, let's not even open that bag. But all of those connections, air, rail, and maritime, how are we going to be able to knit those together again? And then finally, what are going to be the long-term impacts to these industries and especially these small border towns that really depend on cross-border flows? I didn't go into too much detail about the nitty-gritty of where Canadians are shopping, but they have a very large impact on some pretty small towns that are close to the border within the United States. And again, I think some of these impacts are going to be different in different border regions because the US and Canada border regions are connected in these different ways. So that's all I have for my slides, and I think I will stop sharing my screen now. I hope this goes the way it's supposed to. Okay.
Thank you very much, Lori. Those were really interesting slides with great data, and you posed some very interesting questions that I hope we'll get to during the discussion section. Since you give a couple plugs for the Buffalo Niagara region, I'll ask John now to get into his experience in governance of that region.
Thank you. So as Cheryl mentioned, I work for Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. I have worked for him for many, many years. He used to be the Attorney General of New York State. And at that time, the Attorney General has appointee on the board that governs the Peace Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie, Ontario. The Peace Bridge is a binational authority, and it's governed by a board that has 5 Canadian members appointed by the federal government and 5 US members, 4 of whom are appointed by the governor of New York, and 1 of whom is appointed by the state's attorney general, who is an independently elected official. And so I was his, this was not my singular job at the attorney general's office, but I was his appointee. There are, I grew up in Buffalo, as Cheryl mentioned, and I was very familiar with the border crossings across the Niagara River. There are 4 vehicular border bridges over the Niagara River. The Peace Bridge is the highest volume bridge, and it's between Buffalo and Fort Erie. But there are 3 other bridges, the Queenston-Lewiston, the Rainbow Bridge, and the Whirlpool Bridge, which I'll just mention in passing. So the Peace Bridge is a high volume crossing. I had remembered it as the second busiest crossing. It depends on what you're measuring, but it's safe to say that it's a high volume crossing. Now, when Cheryl and I, that's Cheryl and me growing up in Buffalo when we were youths, that's a daguerreotype. That's what we had back then. When we were growing up in Buffalo, traveling to Fort Erie was like traveling to another neighborhood. So that's actually an image on the bottom part of your screen. You're seeing Buffalo's west side, and on the top part of your screen, you have a good overview of Fort Erie. So this sentence made sense to everybody in Buffalo, going to Canada for Chinese. The Happy Jack's is one of several Chinese restaurants on a strip in Fort Erie, Ontario, that when people in Buffalo wanted to have Chinese food, which when Cheryl and I were young was considered exotic, we would go to Canada and we would eat there. And the picture in the bottom right-hand corner is a picture of the patio at Happy Jack's, where it's right on the Niagara River, and that's the Peace Bridge in the background. The local economy benefited on both sides of the border. The Canadian shoppers in Erie County, which is the county where Buffalo is located, contributed significantly to the county's collection of sales taxes. And U.S. Tourism in Canada, it was Toronto is an hour and a half away from Buffalo. It's a very frequent tourist destination for day trips. Many U.S. people own beach houses on Lake Erie on the Canadian side, and there's just a lot. There has always been a lot of cross-border commerce. So again, when Cheryl and I were young, crossing the border was a very, very easy exercise. Usually you'd pull up to a customs agent who would ask the citizenship of whoever was in the car, and sometimes they'd ask if anybody was armed, and then the vexing question if anybody was in possession of citrus fruit. And if the answers to the last two questions were no, then you'd go about your way. But four things happened in our lifetime, I'm saying my lifetime, I'm 51, that have changed that. And I would start with I'm going to touch on all four of these. I have as an asterisk what Lori was talking more about than what I'm going to, which is in March, the border essentially was closed due to COVID-19. But before that, these four developments really changed both the process of crossing the border, and I think it's having a long-term cultural impact on the relationship between people who live in Western New York and in Southern Ontario. So the gas crisis of 1980-81, trade agreements of the late 80s and mid-90s, 9/11, and then a dispute over the Trusted Traveler program. So Lori showed a graph that showed traffic from 1999 to the present. This graph, which I borrowed from a presentation that the general manager of the Peace Bridge did, shows auto traffic from the mid-60s. And what I'm going to point out here is there was this enormous spike in around 1980, 1981. And after that, it went up and down, but really from around 1990 or so, there has been a gradual decline of auto traffic across the Peace Bridge. This is just by comparison, the graph of commercial traffic, which had a steeper rise from the early 70s until 2001. And I'll mention this again later, across the Peace Bridge, there was far more passenger traffic than commercial traffic, and I'll get to why that's important. Just by comparison, these are the traffic charts for the other bridges across the Niagara River. I'm not going to linger on this, but it is worth noting that the Rainbow and Whirlpool Bridge are entirely passenger bridges. Queenston-Lewiston has a commercial traffic as well. So the four developments really can be seen as both related to security and commerce. And I'll start with the gas crisis of 1980, 1981. The price of gas in Canada was much less for a short period of time than it was in the US. And during this period of several months, there was unprecedented traffic of residents of the US going into Canada simply to buy gas. And this would be a blip, except that I'll point out again, that spike you see in 1980, 1981, that spike had a long tail, because for years after, traffic projections would include that spike. And when I was on the Peace Bridge board, I thought that this was ridiculous. It's sort of the same as saying the average wealth of Jeff Bezos and me is about $500 billion, factually accurate. Or that the number of Stanley Cups won between the Buffalo Sabres and the Montreal Canadiens is a total of 24. And I think there's probably one person in the audience that doesn't know those were all won by the Montreal Canadiens. Or the average age in a room occupied by William Shatner and Prince Louis of Cambridge is 45. I mean, all those statements are true, but misleading. In any case, by the mid-1990s, the idea that traffic was headed up fueled an argument over increasing the capacity of the Peace Bridge. And there are 4 images of proposed ways to do that, 3 images of second bridges or twin spans, and 1 of what was called a signature span, a replacement bridge that would have more lanes. So the argument gained momentum based on increased commercial traffic following the trade agreements of the late 80s and mid 90s. So NAFTA got an awful lot of attention, but really the commercial traffic had been rising for a little while before that. There were trade agreements in the late 80s as well. So there was this common perception that traffic was shooting up, and that at some point it would just become a constant traffic jam. And certainly there were many instances of prolonged jams going over the bridge. This is a quote from a story about the New York Times, when there was a debate raging about how to expand the capacity of the bridge. There was an assumption that the capacity needed to expand. So many folks on the US side advocated a replacement bridge, which they called a signature span. And the idea that this type of bridge would become very important to Western New York's cultural identity really drove this argument. Whereas many folks on the Canadian side viewed it as a more practical necessity and favored a second bridge. And there was also, there seemed to be more sentimental attachment to the bridge, the historic Peace Bridge. But you might ask yourself, and for anybody who doesn't recognize that, that's David Byrne singing "You May Ask Yourself" from a Talking Heads video. Anyway, somebody's laughing. How would added lanes in a bridge help the lack of customs agents and immigration officials at the border creating bottlenecks that are especially pronounced during the summer? And again, traffic was actually declining during this time. So my view as a board member was that added lanes were not going to really solve the problem. And here I had alluded to before that even though there was certainly a period when commercial traffic was going up, this is at the height of the differential between auto traffic and truck traffic. So even at its height, there were far more autos than trucks going over the Peace Bridge. There was this cross-border debate that was really raging, and the debate went on for many years, from the mid-90s, where a new bridge or a second span was estimated to cost under $65 million, up to 2010, when the cost was estimated officially at over $700 million. I was on the board at the time, and I estimated it to be closer to $1 billion, based on when the construction would actually take place. The common turn, so there were many side arguments, and some of them were environmental, including having to do with the habitat of a bird called the common tern. But this debate was far from settled by the time of the third incident, 2001, the terrorist attacks in the United States. After that, the US federal government really increased its attention on border security as it related to the prevention of future terrorist attacks. And when I was on the board, which was a few years after that, the board itself primarily focused on this question of Peace Bridge expansion, but the US federal government, as well as the Peace Bridge Authority, took both infrastructure and procedural steps designed to prevent terrorists from crossing the border. So these measures included more expansive and lengthier questioning and documentation requirements. Passports are now required. That wasn't the case before. That lengthened the average amount of time at the customs and inspection booth, and in general made the border crossing a more formal and more harrowing experience. So 10 years after 9/11, this is a quote from a radio story that was done in 2011, traffic fell by 27%. So there were still long delays, but this had less to do with traffic volume and more to do with the process of actually getting across the border. So in ensuing years, there have been various measures taken to mitigate these factors, including the Nexus program, which Lori mentioned, a Nexus-only lane, the use of Easy Pass to pay the toll, which is only done one way now, and some reconfiguration of the Peace Bridge Plaza, the expansion of inspection booths. Nonetheless, the experience of crossing the border is it's a little more formal, a little more harrowing than it used to be. So as a side note, New York has a 445-mile border with Canada, much of which is over land. Up in the upper right-hand corner, the New York State crosses the St. Lawrence River. And so there is a land part of New York State that has a border with Canada, much of which is very easy to walk across. Much of which is not a border and a formal border crossing at all. I mention this because if in the case of very smart terrorists, they would not try crossing at the Peace Bridge, but that's just speculation. There's a lot of dumb ones too. So the other point is the Niagara River itself is hardly a demilitarized zone. I don't know if Cheryl ever did this, but I remember going in the Niagara River in an inner tube, and there's a lot of recreational boating. There's the Niagara Power Project and the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge in the background, and I have no idea if those people fishing are from Canada or the United States. So in recent months, though, a fourth development has shifted the dynamic even further. The U.S. federal government's focus shifted away from terrorism and towards immigration. This newspaper clip is from 2019, and there was a concern that traffic was being held up because more U.S. Customs and Borders personnel were being redeployed to the southern border between the U.S. and Mexico. With fewer inspectors, the time it took to get through the inspection was longer. And then earlier this year, the U.S. federal government essentially kicked New York State out of the Trusted Traveler program because the state passed a law that my boss signed that allows for driver's licenses to be granted to people who do not have to prove their citizenship. And our position was the federal government wanted access to the records of who were not citizens who were getting driver's licenses. Our administration's position was that they wanted to do this to identify people that were in the United States without proper documentation in order to deport them. And our state would not allow the federal government access to that information. So now a New Yorker cannot get a Nexus pass. If a New Yorker has a Nexus pass, they can still use it, but they can't renew it. And so the state government and the federal government got into a very heated argument about this, and this matter has yet to be resolved. And it was sort of put off the front burner by COVID. So COVID has essentially closed the border, as Lori had mentioned. So where are we now? So before the COVID shutdown, there was a retrospective on 20 years since 9/11, really 20 years since the height of the debate about creating a second Peace Bridge or a twin span, and traffic has dropped even more. So you remember this slide from 10 years after 9/11, traffic had dropped. Well, by 2020, traffic had dropped by 38%. Where are we today? This is traffic since 2002, and the top line is total traffic in both directions. The purple line is auto traffic in one direction, and the aqua line is truck traffic in one direction, and then the bottom line is bus traffic in one direction. But you see, it's been going down, and that dramatic spike, that dramatic drop at the end is because of COVID. So there's fewer people crossing between Canada and the United States at the Peace Bridge. The debates on a very regional level about the bridge itself and bridge policy I think soured the waters a little bit, soured the mood a little bit. And the debate within the United States about border policy has also contributed to a sort of souring. So I do think that the COVID crisis will not necessarily have a long-term impact. I think in part about how the SARS crisis is more or less forgotten today. This might be, the COVID might be with us longer and have a more profound impact, but I do think that the 4 incidents that I mentioned since 1980 collectively are having an impact. So that's where we are today. And Cheryl, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Given that it's late in the day for many of us, I especially appreciate the humor, as I know some of our attendees did as well. And I also appreciate the inside knowledge. As many articles as I've read about the replacement span or the potential replacement for the Peace Bridge over the years, I did not know that the common turn factored into that.
It did, yes.
That was useful to know. A couple questions have come in specifically for Lori, and since she does need to leave us at 3:30 our time for another presentation, I'm going to direct those to her. Professor Dupreon has graciously agreed to cede his time for now. Lori, Jim, who's from Surrey, BC, and has spent much of his life on that border, has asked, how is the Point Roberts, Washington crossing a community affected by the current closure?
Great question. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Point Roberts, we call it a geographical oddity. It's a little slice of land connected to mainland British Columbia that's cut off by the 49th parallel. So it's almost like an island, only it's attached to British Columbia, but it's a U.S. territory or a U.S. county. So people that live there that work in Washington State, for example, or children who go to school have to cross an international border 4 times to go there and come home. So they're crossing north into British Columbia, driving through BC, and then going south and crossing into the US. And so when the border restrictions were announced, and I should say it's a pretty small community, I think there's about 1,200 to 1,500 people there, Americans there. And when the border restrictions were announced, there was a lot of concern that that community would become completely isolated and not be able to leave their little space to go grocery shopping, for example, because they're Americans that are cut off from the United States. So interestingly, we have a kind of emergency management system here in the county where I live, which is the border county. And they sprung up pretty quickly a unified command structure and brought together various stakeholders in the community, including hospitals, both Customs and Border Protection, Canada Border Services Agency, and a key representative from Point Roberts who's there, happens to be their fire chief. And we have weekly calls, and every week we talk about Point Roberts. And we, there's complaints sometimes from the community members there that are brought directly to the Customs and Border Protection officials, and then those answers are given back to the community. So I can say that from what I know, that's actually worked pretty well, and those people in Point Roberts have been allowed to enter into Canada in transit on their way to the United States. So they don't have to go through that mandatory 2-week quarantine planning process. They can drive right through and then return. And given how low our volumes are right now, it's like maybe 150 cars a day are going through the border. The officials are well aware of who's coming and going between Point Roberts, more or less. So it's actually worked quite well for now, but it has required a good level of communication and planning so that citizens know what's essential, what's non-essential, and that if they're going to engage on those trips, they'll be able to get back home.
Thanks for that answer. That's a good example of how policy can get really complicated. You've got another question about a specific border crossing. This one is from Don, and he asked about the status of the replacement of the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor. I do know that the new span will be called the Gordie Howe International Bridge, but you may know more about the status.
A little bit, and I would have known more if things hadn't been canceled, because I have discussions with folks from that region more often than I'm having right now. But it was interesting for me to hear John's comments, because some of the projections around that bridge were also based on earlier volumes that have really since declined, but that's a whole nother can of worms I probably shouldn't go into. I think the bridge is, I think it's been fully permitted, and they've moved forward on initial stages of either the planning or the construction, but it's moving forward as far as I know.
Thanks for that. The next two questions are substantive. The first one is from Kay. She asks specifically for you, how is Canada and the US, how are they managing refugee activities at the border since the beginning of this pandemic?
That's a really complicated one. If we talk about broader immigration policy, and I might have to punt the refugee one to John, because I can't really speak to that directly. Out in our region, we just don't handle a whole lot of refugee claims, so it's not something I'm familiar with. I can say that when it comes to immigrant and non-immigrant visa processing, there's a very complex mix of what's still being processed and what's not being processed, because for US work permits, some of those are processed by the State Department and some of those are processed at the border. And I'll say one more thing, which is that currently there are some strong indications that the Trump administration may impose more severe immigration restrictions on the Canadian and Mexican borders, a little bit under the auspices of this COVID-19 pandemic response, and it remains to be seen what those are going to be, but there's some language that has been put out in the Federal Register in the United States that suggests that even those non-immigrant professional worker visas could become really delayed or really reduced.
John, there are a recorded number of refugee crossings at New York State. Any thoughts about this?
Well, it's not really my area of expertise, but I can say that the federal government has reduced the number of refugees coming into the United States, and it has had a profound impact on Buffalo, which has a valued refugee population that's really made a cultural contribution. And within Buffalo and many upstate New York cities, this is the only controversy is it's controversial that the federal government has reduced the influx of refugees into these cities, who have added really a lot to the culture and the population. Upstate New York, unlike Southern Ontario, has struggled with population, and refugees have added to the culture, have added to the economy, have added to the population. I'm less familiar with the actual mechanics of refugees crossing the border, but there's been a lot less of it, and that's had a negative impact.
And Bruno, I believe your research has gone into the area of refugees, certainly migration. Any thoughts about this question?
Yeah, well, I think that on the Canadian side, the restrictions have been quite limited. But I agree with Laurie that the Trump administration is likely to have additional restrictions on asylum seekers. I think that's already the case. And there will be more, I suppose. Yeah.
Thanks. Laurie, a question I had queued up for you is about the regional nature of the Canada-US border that you stressed in your presentation. I find that fascinating, especially since both federal nations concentrate power, including for policymaking, especially in Canada, at the subnational level, so at the provincial or state level. You implied during your presentation that the regional nature of governance is good, but I'm hoping you can elaborate on that more and do so in the context of change, especially changes in Washington, D.C. You talked about the distance between Washington State and Washington, D.C. Certainly, the United States has a president that's very interested in border and immigration issues. Can you talk a little bit about how the regional governance nature might make policy change being driven by Washington more difficult or better?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've always been of the mind that people who live in the border region are people that are the most affected by the border, and so we're going to be the most engaged. And we're also going to be the most aware of what the situations are on the ground. I thought John's example of the little black gas blip was a great example of how you can look at data and interpret it in one way, but if you're aware of actually what's happening on the ground, you could see, oh, that's a blip. So there's that. There's the importance, I think, of the local knowledge, which obviously people in DC and Washington are not going to have to the extent that people on the ground have. And I also think another part of that is when I say governance, I'm not just thinking about policymakers, right? Because policymakers are elected officials. They're cycling through fairly quickly at times, but there's that whole kind of agency, bureaucratic, long-term network of people that are engaged in working on the same issues for multiple years. And it's really, I think, at those scales, so not just the governor and the premier, but those other agencies at those scales where we can have a lot of longevity in those cross-border relationships that don't turn over so quickly like they would based on federally elected officials or even state and provincial elected officials as well.
Thanks. I'll ask if there are any more questions for Lori, while I'm also asking John and Bruno if they have any follow-ups to Lori's response to my question.
Not for me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lori. Bruno will give his presentation. I know you may have to leave during that, so thank you very much. This was very interesting. And for those who have found their Zoom reaction buttons, if you could please give us a virtual clap for Lori.
Thanks for your time, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So the title of my presentation is a bit mysterious, and I'll try to lift the veil of mystery during my presentation, not immediately as I start. But the idea here is to see like a center state at the Canada-US border, and maybe seeing the Canada-US border also like a center state. So we are spoiled to have this US-Canada border, and yet. And so on the US-Canada border, we have a fairly peaceful border. It's been called the longest undefended border. We do not have hundreds of deaths at our borders, as it is the case at the borders of Europe. We can see here each dot represents death, desegregated by different causes. You see the different colors. We do not have coast guards who open fire at unarmed fishermen and refugees. We don't have human rights associations busy designing posters to warn migrants that they should not cross the border by foot because otherwise it's deadly. In Canada, we select very quietly our refugees and migrants. Among the 70 million displaced people globally, that include 3.5 million asylum seekers. Canada resettled in 2018 approximately 30,000 refugees. So it doesn't seem much, but when we compare these numbers of resettlements to what the other countries have been doing, we can see that the effort of Canada is quite substantial, and in comparison, we see that the United States is decreasing the number of resettlements from refugees. We have also very integrated dependent economies. We can see here that the US exports to Canada accounted for 18% of the overall exports, while Canada's exports to the US had a partner share of 75%, so very substantial here. We have also cross-border communities, as Lori and John have showed, that are very vibrant. Here, this is an example of cultural activity on the border, library and opera here. Or theater, and some people also cross the border every day for work, and so Lori touched upon that as well. So given this context, we can say that we are really spoiled with our Canada-US border, so spoiled that we might even perceive it as something that is a little boring. And yet we have already seen with the presentations that we had that it's far from being boring. And in fact, we are facing a significant paradox here. Although the Canada-US border is fairly immune from some of the global issues that have been mentioned previously, the border securitization process that has been at work for at least 20 years now tells a very different story. In other words, without major problems on the US-Canada border, we should not witness a border securitization process. So how to make sense of this paradox? No major problems, but still a securitization process. So to unpack this paradox, we will cover two short sections here. First, we are going to examine policies of border securitization that have been quite sustained since 2001. And secondly, we're going to see that this process of border securitization has been designed by governments that see the border like center states. And by that, I use a notion that has been coined by a political sociologist, Loïc Wacquant, who argues that center states act very differently based on socioeconomic categories of people. And so center states will be very liberal at the top of the social hierarchy and very paternalistic at the bottom, which presents radically different faces at the two ends of the social hierarchy. So I will relay a couple of scenarios in conclusion and also suggestions regarding the future of borders. So first, the sustained border securitization policy since 2001. So after 9/11, the militarization of the border was justified by the US administration because of terrorism mainly, but now it is being increasingly legitimized by illegal immigration, as John has said. Now in the US, in the 90s, the focus on illegal immigration already existed under the Clinton administration, and we can see here the operation Hold the Line in El Paso. There was a bunch of operations to tackle illegal immigration as well as the fight against organized crime. And this contributed to increase budgets, agents, walls, technologies of the US Border Agency. And so 9/11 extended those practices to the northern border. And here I'm going to provide some example of this sustained border securitization. So we can see here in this figure the increased resources for the US Customs and Border Protection, which I will call with its acronym CBP. And this is very different from what we can observe with the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA. We can see that the resources are fairly stable. And so the increased budget of CBP allows to get new border security technologies, to get more people on the ground. And here we enter the space of the so-called border industrial complex, also called border security capitalism by Todd Miller. And those technologies are directly derived from the military sector and contribute to Mexicanize or to militarize the US-Canada border in providing military technologies of control, surveillance, and also arrest. And so Todd Miller has an interesting quote here. He argues that at the Phoenix Expo, which I visited every year since 2012, there are companies developing concealment cams that can be hidden inside real or artificial cacti. There is a large tower smack dab in the middle of the conference hall, a structure that looks like an old European fortress. However, if you climb its stairwell, you will see pictures depicting the tower withstanding the force of a large fireball. I am forced to imagine a fireball hitting the border, which, to the best of my knowledge, has never happened. And so at more than 5,000 miles, the US-Canada border is more than twice the length of the border with Mexico. And yet we can see here that only approximately 2,000 US border agents patrol it, which is to be compared with more than 70,000 agents along the US-Mexico border. But we should note that despite the significant quantitative difference, US border agents contribute to make both borders more uniform. In fact, CBP officials who are first trained and on duty on the Mexico-US border later move to the Canadian border. And so with that, they bring with them the corporate culture of CBP from the southern border. They bring values, they bring beliefs, behaviors that are tainted with US-Mexico border challenges. So in 2017, the Canadian Bill C-23 gave US border guards quite unprecedented powers to question, search, and detain travelers in Canadian airports and other precarious areas. And so this is a sign that there was, to a certain extent, a synchronization of border securitization on both sides of the border, generally initiated by the US, but then, to a certain extent, followed closely by the Canadian government. And earlier this year, in March, we learned that leaked documents revealed that CBP had requested the Department of Defense to deploy more than 1,500 troops to both the southern and northern borders to support border enforcement during the coronavirus pandemic. And here were requested 1,000 troops to the US-Canada border. And as we know, Prime Minister Trudeau pushed back and the US plan was shelved. So border security has also reoriented border community initiatives, as Laurie and John have shown. The Canada-US border has also disrupted Indigenous peoples' movements across the border. And here there is an interesting excerpt from a paper, but given the time, I won't be able to read it, but the slides will be available after the presentation. And so here I would like to jump to the second section, which is to try to understand how this border securitization process occurred using those lenses of the center state. And so Loïc Vacant argues that a center state displays opposite visages at the two ends of the class structure. It is uplifting and liberating at the top, where it acts to leverage the resources and expand the life options of the holders of economic and cultural capital, but it is castigatory and restrictive at the bottom when it comes to managing the population, destabilized by the deepening of inequality and the diffusion of work insecurity and ethnic anxiety. And so here, what is interesting is with this definition to see that the border is not a mere material tool. This is also a symbolic tool that is used to stage, to some extent, the sovereignty of the state. And it means also that redesigning the border is important so that some flows will be allowed and not others. And we see on this map basically a strong division between part of the global north and the south. We can see in yellow the so-called Golden Ghetto, which is a zone where legislative and military tools are put in place to prevent the arrival of migrants, and in red, the so-called havens, and countries that account for 62% of global wealth, but make up only 15% of the population. And the people of these countries can travel across the globe almost entirely unhindered, because we have basically passports or visa at will. And so it means in this context to allow the flow of people, goods, services and capital for business, for touristic purposes, while at the same time criminalizing the flow of other people, other goods, and so on and so forth. So securitizing the border means making administrative categories. So in other words, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and what should be monitored. It means segregating, it means creating and reinforcing divisions and inequalities, but inequalities that would be compatible with the established political, economic, and racial inequalities within each country. So that's important here to see that borders also allow the articulation of the inequalities of each country. And regarding the US-Canada border, it means articulating those inequalities between the two countries in a certain way. So borders will be considerate, laissez-faire for those at the top of the societal structures, but borders will be brutal and punitive for those who will be at the bottom. So for instance, temporary foreign workers here in Canada who pick fruits and vegetables work in Canada with less rights, less labor rights than we generally have here. And so fortunately, and we can see here some stories from the press, people fight to grant them more rights. Here examples from the government, from NGOs, but also we can see that they do not travel as easily as we do. And for instance, here with the story on the top left, we can see that temporary foreign workers will be allowed into Canada from the US. And in other words, they will be allowed to travel via the US, for instance, to have a transit flight without necessarily getting arrested or deported immediately. However, and the question then is, what about the middle class? What about most of us who are somewhere in between the top and the very bottom? How are borders going to be designed for us? And so here the suggestion is that borders will often be similar to what people at the top experience. So no problem to travel, the US and Canadian passports providing broad mobility powers. And for instance, we have here the Nexus card. This is what John alluded to earlier, which is a voluntary program that facilitates cross-border mobility for upper and middle social categories. And we see that sometimes at airports or border crossings, most of us wait, but some people don't wait. And they, in many cases, have a Nexus card. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, quite ironically and tragically, that people with those powerful passports can also be stopped. And they can be in trouble when they travel internationally, which is something that generally only happens to people from the global south. So I think that the COVID-19 has shown basically the possibility for people of the global north to be suddenly stranded and being exposed to the brutality of sovereign power. But the borders for the middle class will be also sometimes foggy, uncertain for people like us. And this will allow us to not only experience the sovereign power, but also to see the staging of sovereign power. When we, for instance, we wait our turn to get screened, we can see people being screened. And so this is how the staging of sovereignty occurs. So US and Canadian border officials in this context have been accused of racially profiling, of abuses of power, and especially Canadian and American citizens, as well as refugee claimants and newcomers. And complaints have often been met with contempt, especially in the US, despite the very hard work of human rights organizations and immigration organizations. Here are a couple of examples from and And it can be related, of course, to the current political climate in the US. On the contrary, in Canada, things are not necessarily getting better. I mean, CBSA agents can also do foolish things, but it seems that the response from the federal government was not a bit less lenient, and that complaints were met with a bit more seriousness, and also the fact that in May 2019, the federal government introduced before the House of Commons Bill C-98, which basically made some amendments to the Act in order to have an outside oversight body for the CBSA, which is currently an agency that does not have an outside oversight body. And so therefore the US-Canada border articulates each country's inequalities that are evolving. And securitizing the border means making it generally more difficult, if not impossible, for some people to cross it. So in conclusion, I would like to suggest a few ideas from colleagues. Basically, the securitization process is not the only possibility for the US-Canada border and for any other border. Other options exist, even in the light of COVID-19. So first, Correa Cabrera and Conrad, so one American and Canadian colleagues, suggest that there are two possible scenarios for the future of North American borders considering COVID-19. The worst case scenario, and I read the quotes here, the worst case scenario would be an extended or even permanent partial to total closure of the continent's borders that would include Trump's border wall, a halt on legal and irregular immigration in the three countries, and a renegotiation of the USMCA. And the second scenario, which they deem to be a more plausible scenario, and one that scares conservative and nationalist forces in the US in particular, is that a form of authoritarian capitalism, call it the Chinese model, will gain dominance in North America. So I really suggest to everyone here to read this piece by Correa and Conrad. That's, I think, fairly stimulating read, even if you don't agree with the scenarios they propose. And in order not to finish on a very, very somber tone, I would like to propose other recommendations by critical political geography scholar Rhys Jones, who suggested, and it was before the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think that his recommendations are still pretty relevant. And he proposes a number of ideas to reform the border and immigration regime. For him, violent borders are unacceptable, and also he considers that displaced people, refugees especially, have the right to move. And he makes three specific recommendations. First, he calls for a global movement against borders. So it means that citizens like us can also consider that borders should be designed very differently. He suggests also the development of global laws for fair and humane working conditions. And finally, the genuine implementation of social safety nets for the poor and the environment. And so I think that tackling the COVID-19 pandemic at the border also implies other challenges, whether we want them or not. And those ones are some of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno. I'm really glad you brought that sociological perspective to add to the economic and political perspectives that Lori and John provided, because we can't understand the concept of borders or our experience at borders without understanding the sociology and the cultural issues there. One specific question that came up for you was about this issue of agents at the Mexico and US border and the fact that the US has been moving agents between the southern and northern borders. Janelle asked, is the number of agents assigned related to the population of the area where the agents are assigned? For example, Buffalo Niagara has about 10 million people in that area. Does that mean there's more border agents than there would be, say, at El Paso?
Not necessarily. There may be a correlation, but it's also related to the types of threats that are perceived by the CBP. And so it's not necessarily related to the population. For instance, I think it was last year, approximately 700 border agents from the US-Canada border have been transferred to the US-Mexico border. And it's not because there was a drop along the US-Canada border area. It's simply because there was a change of political priorities and redeployment of agents along the US-Mexico border, with the idea of suggesting that, oh, this is really, US-Mexico border is a threat in itself, and we need not just to have CBP agents, but also the military assisting the CBP. So I think it's more a question of, of perceived threats, alleged threats along the border.
Thank you. John, we're glad you were able to reconnect because a question came in for you. Jim, who had asked the question earlier about Point Roberts, Washington, is wondering what percentage of Buffalo Sabres and Buffalo Bills fans come from Canada, say what percentage of season ticket holders. He thinks the number in the Seattle area for the football and baseball teams there is about 10%. I'm thinking in Buffalo it's much higher. Do you know those numbers?
Yeah. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I think it's around 20%. I don't have the exact figures. In fact, I'm wondering if I could pull that up while I'm sitting here. But I think you're right, Cheryl, that it is significantly higher than 10%. Keep in mind that the city of Buffalo itself has a population of 270,000 people. It's in a county called Erie County, which has a population of about 920,000 people. But Southern Ontario, with Toronto, Hamilton, Mississauga, are combined much, much bigger. And those are just the big cities between Buffalo and Toronto. And I hear from my parents that in the 50s, people from Toronto would come to Buffalo because it was the big city. And in more recent times, it's been the reverse. That said, there are a lot of Toronto Maple Leaf fans that cross over to see the Sabres play the Maple Leafs. And there's a lot of people who live in Canada to the south of Toronto that are season ticket holders. There are football fans that come over to see the Bills. Not as many CFL fans that go to see the Argos, but there's absolutely, whenever there's a game, a Sabres game in Buffalo or a Bills game, that is a heavily trafficked time.
Thanks. And since you mentioned the Toronto Maple Leafs, I'm going to tell a little story that will lead to a question about changes at the border, including the Mexicanization of the border, which is a term that Bruno has coined. And I apologize to any Toronto Maple Leafs fans who are participating today or listening. I recently read a story about the Buffalo Sabres hockey team from 1999, reflecting on their experience of beating the Toronto Maple Leafs to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. And to a T, all of the players, and there's at least 22 players on a professional hockey team, said that the best moment of that season was when their bus from Toronto back to Buffalo, because they had one in Toronto, got to the border, and it's late in the evening, and they were celebrating on the way to the border. They hit the Peace Bridge, and the U.S. Customs agent came onto the bus, and as the agents usually do when they get onto a bus full of people, stopped at the driver's seat and asked for everyone's ID, and got one or two people down the bus and realized this is the Buffalo Sabres on the bus. So as he went down the aisle, instead of asking for IDs, he slapped high five to all the players. And then he came back up to the front of the bus where the Sabres' famous goalie, Dominik Hasek, dumped a bottle of beer over the customs agent's head, at which point all the players were like, and then the agent said, yeah, and ran off the bus. And the reason I tell the story is again, not to rub this into any Toronto Maple Leafs fans who might be sending me messages in the chat box right now, but to say that sports are in North America and I think say most of the world very important culturally, and they really help form a community. And I believe the Sabres players said that was the best experience in that season because they felt that they were something larger than a hockey team winning a game, but they were a force that made the community feel happy and positive. And the Buffalo area is one that has suffered great population and economic loss over the last few decades. So my question to Bruno is, if that was not a border agent who may have been raised in Buffalo or spent his entire career at the Peace Bridge, living at the Buffalo-Canada, or the U.S.-Canada border, and developed an affinity, if that were, say, a 24-year-old born in Utah, just moved up to the Peace Bridge for 6 months from the Mexico border, do you think those kind of changes in staffing at the border will eventually have a cultural impact or in a social impact in the border communities?
That's a good question. I think that people who are recruited by the CBP are not generally coming just from the border regions along the US-Mexico border, but from other areas, other states, but they have to start on the US-Mexico border, just because this is where the majority of people are, and this is where they're supposed to be trained, etc. And after a few years, then they can request to be transferred to another area, including the Canada-US border. So I think that generally speaking, although they are going to bring some of those practices and values with them, I think that many of them as well are going to recognize that it's a little bit absurd to do that. Because the environment is different, it's generally more peaceful. I mean, nothing happens, or not much. So I think that although there is this, this issue with the sort of corporate culture that is transferred from one area to the other, there is also the possibility of finding very more or less quickly an affinity with the culture where they are.
Mm-hmm. And I'll follow up for you, Bruno, and John may comment on this as well. John, in your slides, you noted the decline in passenger traffic, and as did Lori. If the US-Canada border becomes one where more, at least at the physical border, so I'm not talking about airline flights into US or Canadian cities from the other country, but if more of the traffic is economic over time and less about less passenger traffic for personal errands or leisure, do you see that impacting the local communities culturally or socially in any way? Or even the Canada-US relationship at large? Bruno, thoughts about that?
Okay, or John wants to start first, maybe?
Oh, sure, John.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we definitely saw that during the mid '90s and the early 2000s, where there was an increase in truck traffic, which did a couple things. The one was it did contribute to both congestion, and also before there were added inspection booths and inspection lanes, it added to the amount of time it took for an average vehicle to get through the inspection. So it made the experience of crossing the border take longer. The other impact was on the U.S. side of the border at the Peace Bridge. The bridge empties out into a residential neighborhood, which is not the case on the Canadian side of the border. So some of the neighborhood residents have had complaints for 20 years or more about air pollution that they attribute to increased truck traffic, including truck idling on the Peace Bridge Plaza. It's not as big an issue on the Canadian side. It's also not as big an issue because there's not a neighborhood there. It's not as big an issue at the Rainbow Bridge or the Whirlpool Bridge, which are automobiles only. The Whirlpool Bridge has been converted into a Nexus-only bridge. So that is designed for people with Nexus to have the smoothest possible experience crossing the border. It's more or less little known other than by people who have Nexus. But the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge, on the other hand, the truck traffic makes it a less desirable bridge for autos to cross. So I think that has had an impact just on the practice. But
oh, unfortunately, John, you froze. It must be bad weather between here and New York. Bruno, did you have thoughts in response to my question?
Yeah, so I think that maybe using the example of Cascadia, where Laurie lives, I know that when I studied there 6 years ago, it was, interviewees said to me that, for instance, when they tried to extend some border checkpoints, they had a number of issues that directly impacted the community. And so deciding, for instance, to expand the Peace Arch area for the Olympic Games was really a massive problem that lasted several years, because they needed to buy property on each side of the border with different, legislations, regulations, not the same opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly to what John said, the urban design on each side of the border can vary quite significantly. So it was really, really an issue that lasted several years. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question. But.
Yes, you did. I'll ask another one that I came with, and I think many listening will have as well. And I know, John, you may need to run, but there's a couple other questions that came in that I'll pose to Bruno for anyone who would like to stay after 4 o'clock SAS time. My question is, what does the future hold for the Canada-US border? John, I'll ask you to go first since I know you need to leave.
Yeah, that's a good one. You know, I hearken back to days of our youth when the Canada-US border was, at least where we grew up, Cheryl, was the border itself was almost an afterthought, and the cultural and economic connection was like a left and a right arm of the same body, and that you have to think that is good for both sides of the border and good for the future of both communities and both countries. To this day, I have not heard of a major terrorist attack coming from Canada, nor have I heard about an influx of undocumented Canadian immigrants into the United States. And those seem to be among the larger concerns of the federal government, but it has a very profound impact on the local communities. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about the future, because I think that these trends that have had a deleterious effect have, the relationship could survive bumps and jolts and spikes once in a while, but the one on top of another negative development have been going on for many years. So the optimism is that there is still an awful compelling pull for people from Southern Ontario to cross the border into Western New York and vice versa. And the attractions of both sides of the border are such that they pull against larger national or even or international trends that might be deleterious. So I have a mixed view. I'm a little concerned though.
As am I. Bruno?
I apologize for losing the connection a couple of times. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thanks again for joining us, John.
Yeah, Cheryl. So I will answer your question a bit indirectly. So I'll start by saying that, you know, growing up in Europe, in a border region, specifically in Strasbourg, close to the German border, I got used to basically crossing the border without even seeing any border agent. So in my youth, we were just crossing the bridge between Strasbourg and Kiel over the Rhine River, and that was it. What was changing was the signs, the language, a few things, but that was it. Of course, this is very different from what we see, I mean, at the external borders of Europe. I mean, you have seen this map of death at the doors of Europe, and of course, the situation in Strasbourg, in the area, I mean, at internal borders is very different. But this is basically what I grew up with. And I think that as far as I've been able to learn and from people, from readings, the Canada-US border was a little bit similar to that. So I think that ideally, if we could move back or move toward a border that has very limited checks, etc., or is almost invisible, why not? At the same time, I'm a little bit concerned that if the border becomes invisible, it won't disappear. So basically, it will be using different types of technologies, will be tracked, etc. So I think that that's another issue. So I'm think that we won't go back to the border that we knew. Basically, the idea of a world without borders, I think, is vanishing, and we are going toward a world that with more borders. And so the problem is, can we do something to maybe have not such deleterious, such negative borders, but also take into consideration shared values, and I shared some of them at the end. I think that most Americans and Canadians share those values. So I think that trying to relay them to our political officials might be one thing. Also, the role of border communities is important, as John said, to basically convey another voice, another message to our federal governments.
Bruno, you implied that the French-German border of your youth was not unlike the Canadian-U.S. border of John and my childhood. Kay wondered, other than the length of the border, is there anything about the Canada-U.S. border that's unique and different from other world borders?
I'm not sure. I think that, I don't know if it's absolutely unique, but I think that the proximity between the two countries in very different areas, culturally, economically, politically, etc., is just quite significant. And so I think all those similarities make the border quite absurd.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of specific borders, Jim asked specifically about a couple of the crossings nearby. There's the North Portal crossing from Saskatchewan to North Dakota, and then there's a crossing into North Dakota from Pembina, crossing Manitoba. Do either of you know whether the amount of passenger traffic has been reduced out here in the prairies, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, Manitoba, North Dakota?
Go ahead, John.
No, I'm sorry, I don't have that.
Okay.
I think I've read a paper a couple of weeks ago. I think there is a decline, so I have to double check. So
Okay.
Short answer, I don't know.
Okay.
Vaguely, I remember that there was a decline, but I have to double check.
Jim, we'll get back to you with an answer after we check on that. And I'll field one last question from Janelle and pose it to both of you. We'll start with John. She asks, how does border security relate to agricultural markets and trade between the US and Canada? And will that trade be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think in volume, the procedures for shipment of agricultural products back and forth are pretty well established. On a smaller scale, it is a little bit tougher to bring some food products across the border. I made the joke about the orange, but it's actually very real. When it was easier to cross the border, it was very common for US shoppers to shop for food in Canada simply because there were certain products that were available, there weren't brands that were available that weren't available in the US. And it's especially for folks in Fort Erie, they might have come into the US to shop at larger supermarkets than existed in Fort Erie. But it is a little tougher to cross over. I think that the COVID border shutdown is temporary and is not necessarily going to have a very, very long tail. I could be wrong about that, and I'm not saying that the impact of COVID on all of our lives is not going to have a long tail, but I'm not sure that it's going to have a profound impact on border crossing policy in the long term.
I know that I came back from the Ontario Bakery in Fort Erie with cannolis and Italian bread under my car seat quite a few times. Bruno, any thoughts? You have the floor for the last time.
Oh, so I'm really sorry because I don't have really a clear answer to that. I'm not very familiar with agricultural issues across the border, and even less, the trade relationship in this sector. So I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay. Janelle, we'll get back to you after I have a chance to check with Lori and see if she has any specific responses to that question. Thanks for all of the questions. This was a great discussion. I wish it could continue, but I know it's getting late, especially on the East Coast where John is. Please join me in clicking your thumbs up or clapping hands emojis for John and Bruno. And thanks, Karen Jaster, for organizing this event. And remember that we'll send you an email showing you where on the website the recording is if you'd like to share it with friends. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Thanks, John. Thanks, Karen. And thanks, everyone.